panelists here today who are going to talk about getting the book contract and the book industry in general. We have on our panel, starting over here on this end, Sonja Condit, who has an MFA from Converse College, found an agent, and published her first book, Starter House. We have some for sale over there. Starter House is out from HarperCollins as of January 1, I guess. So she is just starting her book tour, so she has a good story about how someone from Taylor, South Carolina winds up with a New York book contract. In the middle, we have all the way from New York City, Marly Rusoff, who is an agent. And Marly started as a bookseller in Minneapolis and has worked in marketing, publicity, and now as a publisher, she's worked with some of my favorite writers, including Margaret Atwood, Paul Theroux, Ron Rash, many of you know Pat Conroy, and so she also is a publisher and has just published Cassandra King's new book and her second book, which she has over there. And finally, our moderator tonight is Ashley Warlick, who lives in Greenville, has published 3 novels from Houghton Mifflin, and she can tell, I will ask Ashley to start off by telling us a little bit about her journey as a writer. Ashley now is editor of Edible Upcountry. She publishes in places like Garden and Gun, and she teaches at the Governor's School for the Arts in Greenville. So what we will do tonight is Ashley is going to moderate a 30-minute conversation here on the subject of getting a book contract. We're going to break for 15 minutes, which is a time for networking for you guys, for chatting with staff like Meg and Ann, or our panelists. You're going to fill out a card over there if you have a question. And please fill out a card and ask your question. And then we come back for 30 minutes and Ashley will pose your question to our panelists. So it's my pleasure now to turn this program over to Ashley Warlick.
Oh, microphone. Very quickly, and only because Betsy kind of insisted, I started writing in college, which would have been 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago now. And my first novel was published shortly after I graduated from college. So I wrote the manuscript, most of it my junior and senior years in college. And my writing instructor at the time, who I also believe Sonja worked with, Robert Olmsted, put me in touch with his agent and editor in New York. It was 20 years ago, which was, I think we'll probably end up talking a lot about a different time. And I found my current agent because my original agent was fired. He was apparently spending too much time editing manuscripts and not enough time selling manuscripts, which is another sad thing that we might talk about in terms of the changes in the industry. So by sort of default, and because my book was already promised to Houghton Mifflin in the middle of the publication process, I ended up with the agent that I have now, who is Amanda Urban, and she's at ICM, which is a big New York agency. She has a nickname, Binky, and Binky and I talk like maybe once a year, if we really need to. So it's not, I think that there are lots of different relationships that people have with agents, and mine is sort of red-headed stepchildish. But more interestingly, Sonja has just gone through this process. So I really wanted to start with your story about how you wrote your book and how you found your agent and how your agent found your publisher.
Okay. Well, I had started writing again after many years of not writing. And I went to Converse through the MFA program, which was wonderful. Learned a lot. And one of the nice things they do is that in the residencies, they'll have visiting professionals from editors and agents, people like that. And so in my final residency, Jenny Bent, who is now my agent, was visiting. She gave a presentation about how to get an agent, and she also was available for pitch sessions where any of the students could sit down with her and show her what they had. And I showed, the book was finished at that time, so I showed her the first chapter and a one-page synopsis. She was interested, so I emailed the whole thing, and we went through multiple edits because it wasn't as much finished as I had thought. I was done, but no, I was not done. And then when she was happy with it, she sold it very quickly. Only that part of it only took about 2 weeks. Once I finally gave up and did what she wanted. I was kind of stubborn about not wanting to cut some things from early in the book. She said, no, you have to cut those parts, they're boring.
Can I ask you what kind of editing process you went through with your publisher after Jenny was done?
Not very much, although there was one major plot change. She said to me, she called me up, and this was an actual in-person conversation, not an email. And she said, okay, well, there's a problem in the middle of the book, which is you can't kill the dog. And I said, no, you don't understand. I really want to kill the dog. She said, no, readers will never forgive you if you kill a dog. You cannot kill the dog. So we negotiated about the dog for a while. And I said, well, what if it's not a dog? What if it's some less attractive animal like a ferret or a raccoon or a skunk? Could I kill a skunk? So we had a lot of conversation about the dog. And if you happen to read the book, you can rest assured that it is perfectly safe to fall in love with the dog. I absolutely promise.
I killed a dog too.
That's a no-no.
My third book, and that was the one comment. I was like, you can't kill the dog.
So you can kill as many people as you like, she said. Just not kill a dog.
Awesome. Okay, sort of from the other side of these scenarios, Marly, can you tell us how you became an agent and what reading a manuscript looks like for you?
Does this work? It's not working. Oh, yeah. Okay, just have to get close. So, I started out as a bookseller, and I love going into Hub City Bookshop. I love going into bookstores still. I was very young. I was actually an art history major, but I grown up in a bookbindery because my father was a bookbinder and a book collector. And I loved books. There was nothing I loved more. So while I was going to the university, I would work in bookstores. And at a certain point, I just came to understand that the only time I was truly happy was when I was in the bookstore. And so I had an opportunity and very little money to start a shop on campus, and I took it. And I began running a small bookstore with a ton of poetry. All my friends were writers. This is Minneapolis. We're looking at the 1970s. Everyone I knew was a writer. And there was really no place to hang out except my little bookstore. And so we all started hanging out there. Some of them had come back from the Iowa Writers Workshop, and they really needed to have a place to be with other writers. And an apartment became available above my bookstore. And I rented it, moved a few couches, coffee pots, the whole thing. I moved these small magazines, the literary journals, all upstairs. And my writer friends would come to me. I had a partner who was like a financial partner. He put in $3,000, I put in $3,000. So we're not talking about big bucks here, But I would turn the key over to one of my poet friends who needed to make some money to pay the rent. And he would do workshops with the poets and charge them $5 each to do a workshop. So I had this after-hours club running above my bookstore that grew and grew and grew, and pretty soon it was more successful than the bookstore. It was more important to the community than the bookstore. And when I was having to make a decision that looked like I'd have to close it because I didn't have the money, I went to all my friends who were writers and said, what if we form a kind of a guild, people who care about books, people who care about writing, people who care about reading, and we'll call it the Loft because it's the loft above my store. And if everybody would just pay $15 a year, I'll keep the coffee pot going and the couches, and we'll have a place to gather to celebrate any publication. At that point, there were very few writers except for Robert Bly that published out of Minnesota. And that's what we did. We started, I got 12 people together. We had a board. We called it The Loft, and Garrison Keeler did the fundraiser for me. He wasn't famous then. We had a hell of a good time, and a lot of poets read, and there was music and dancing, and I sold 200 memberships to this room. And so The Loft, that was almost 40 years ago, is one of the largest organizations for writers now. And they do about 160 classes a year, and they have a tremendous online program. If you want to work with other people who can help you with, say, teen novels or memoir, you can do online classes. So if the MFA program isn't for you, this is an online opportunity that I think that, and many of you might benefit from. So fast forward, I leave the bookstore, I get a job, a publisher offers me a job, moves me to Chicago. I do sales out of Chicago for Houghton Mifflin. And because of some of the special events I was used to doing, because I did that with writers, people in New York noticed, and Nan Talese, who was one of the publishers there at the time, she was the editor-in-chief, would read my call reports, and instead of writing about, whatever was going on at the, Books A Million or something, I would write little critiques of the books that I was trying to sell, I didn't know that I wasn't supposed to, but that's what I was doing. So suddenly Nan Talese is paying attention to me, and this was purely, I just was trying to do my job. So I get a call, someone's leaving the New York office, they're looking for a publicity person, and they asked if I would be interested. My sister had moved to New York and was about to get married, and so a studio apartment was available. And my sister said, well, why don't you throw your hat in the ring? And I thought, well, they'll never hire me. I have no publicity experience. And at that point, I thought the people in New York were like gods and goddesses to me. These were publishing professionals, and I was just this little hippy-dippy bookseller out of Minneapolis. So I was quite intimidated. I went in, I had the meeting, and by God, they offered me the job. And not only did they offer me the job, they sent a truck to Chicago, they packed up my apartment, and I moved to New York. That was about 28 years ago. So I was the head of publicity in the New York office of Houghton Mifflin, and then for about 9 years, and then I was the head of publicity and marketing and the associate publisher at Doubleday. The last book I did at Houghton was Tim O'Brien, The Things We Carried. And I had so many wonderful writers that I worked with, and I loved what I did. I absolutely loved what I did. I did Ethan Kanan stories too. I worked with Margaret Atwood on The Handmaid's Tale, and one day Nan came to me with The Prince of Tides. Pat was a friend of mine at the time, because when I had my little hippie bookstore, his sister Savannah the poet was one of my customers, and she was a friend, and so she introduced me to her brother Pat, who had just published The Great Santini, and I knew him well. I knew Carol well, and we would all go to the North Shore, Lake Superior, and hang out together. So when Nan delivers me this novel and says, Pat's just delivered this book, would you read it? I read it and was blown away by it. And I was telling someone the story today. I thought, this is really interesting, it's wonderful, except he can't make the sister a schizophrenic poet because his sister Carol is a poet, and she suffers from schizophrenia, and this will be a terrible thing. And so I went into Nan's office and said, Nan, I want you to talk to Pat Conroy and tell him he can't do this because Carol will be devastated and she'll never speak to him again. And Nan said, well, I've read the novel, I think she has to be a poet. And so I was in agony over this, because in a sense, what I'm telling you now is that people in publishing are human beings, and we go through these things. So I came in and ended up, I said, she'll never speak to him, and she never did, really. It's a big problem in their relationship till this day. But I had a conversation with Pat about it, and I learned something, because when I talked to Pat about it, I said, why does she have to be a poet? Why can't you change it? And he said, Carol's a poet, she can tell her story, she can write whatever she likes, and I give her that privilege, she has that privilege to do that. But I'm a writer, and I have a sister who's a poet, and who had problems, and it's my story to tell as the brother, and that's the story I'm telling, and it's, no one can take that from a writer. A writer can tell the stories that they need to tell. And so it was a lesson for me in working with writers, and that I still know today as an agent. So I went through all that, 10 years at Houghton Mifflin, 10 years at Doubleday, and then I started my own agency. I actually had sold a few books out of my little bookstore. So Betsy would probably understand how this happens. People come in and they say, how do I get published? I got a manuscript, and and they want the bookseller to help them. And that's why she has Hub City Press, I'm sure, because there's only so much you could do. But I had to go to New York, and the way I really became an agent was long before I became an agent. And that's when I heard a lecture by a young woman who was a Jungian analyst, and she'd just come to Minneapolis. I thought the lecture was fantastic. It was about the Persephone myth. And I thought, this is amazing stuff. Maybe this is a book. So when Robert Bly came into my bookstore, he was on his Great Mother thing at the time. I said, who's your editor in New York? And he said, HarperCollins, or Harper & Row, and he told me Fran McCullough. So I took her lecture notes when I went to visit my sister, and I walked in to Harper with no appointment. I mean, truly, like, looking, I'm sure, like a complete freak. I walked in, and I went to the secretary at the desk, and I said, I'd like to see Frances McCullough, please. And they said, do you have an appointment? Which was a logical question. And I said, no, but I'm only in town for a couple of days, and I have something I think she might be interested in. So Fran, to her credit, invited me into her office. I sat down, and I pitched this idea to her. I said, I think this is a perfect HarperCollins, Harper & Row book. And it's a mother and daughter story using the Persephone myth to talk about the psychological relationship between mothers and daughters, blah, blah, blah. And I'd like to give you these pages. And so she looked at it and she said, it looks interesting. She said, are you her agent? And I said, what's an agent? And then I really didn't know. And so she said, well, an agent is a person who represents the interests of the writer. So I said, well, I guess I am. And so I ended up publishing it myself out of the bookstore because it took Fran too much time. And after I sold 2,000 copies, I called Fran and I said, I've already sold 2,000 copies. I think you better reconsider this. And so they offered her a contract, and it was published as The Moon and the Virgin, and it's still in print now with a small press. So that was how I started agenting. But the truth is, I sold 3 books that way. I did the contracts, I called all my writer friends, I said, give me your contracts, and I studied them, and I would cross out anything that was crossed out in their contracts, and send it back. But the one thing I didn't do is I never put in a percentage for myself. So I thought, this is even worse than book selling. I'm making $50 a week as a bookseller. As an agent, I'm making squat, it was like, so it never occurred to me that this would be my career until I got to New York, and I'd see these agents show up in their expensive clothes and their chauffeur cars, and I'm thinking, what did I do wrong, So I figured out the system, and I decided that the system of representing writers was always what I wanted to do. It was always when I was happiest. I was around books. I was around the people who cared about books, cared enough to devote their lives to writing books. And what could be better? So after I got fed up with corporate publishing, I decided to become an agent. And in a way, it was an honest decision, because all the years I worked in publishing, my first loyalty was to the author. So in some ways, it's a miracle that Random House tolerated me, that Houghton Mifflin kept me going, and that they promoted me and they took care of me. So I'm grateful to them. And there's some very good people in all of those places. But the business has changed tremendously. And what I'm doing now is 11 or 12 years since I started my agency is a different business than it was 10 years ago. And I think that's one of the things that all of us, all of you who want to write, will have to come to terms with, that it's not the same business, but you are still the content providers. It's just that the way things are structured right now, it's like a real estate market where you have a buyer's market and a seller's market. And we're going through a time that's particularly difficult for writers to break in. But the good news is that because so many good people are not finding contracts, there's been a tremendous growth in really good small presses. And these small presses tend to give focused attention. You've got Hub City, you've got Grey Wolf, got 7 stories. They're good publishers. They don't offer big advances, but they can help you develop your career. And that's on the plus side. That's my story.
What do you think that the rise of small presses, okay, if we say that the traditional route to publication was that a writer wrote a book, found an agent, and the agent sold the book. What do you think that the rise of small presses is going to do to that transaction?
I do think that a lot of agents are now looking at small presses as an option in a way they never did before. It's still important as a writer to go out there with the best work you can possibly do on your own, to write a query letter to agents, send it out, understand that this is a business, that you are, in a sense, a sole proprietor of your life. If you write a good letter, and I brought one, just as I was leaving the office, I thought, you know what, I'm gonna make some copies of this letter. I take very few clients, but once in a while I do. And so this letter came in and I read it and I thought, you know, this is a damn good letter. I'll bring it with me in case anyone wants to see a good pitch letter, a query letter to me. And so I'll put it on the table after we're done during the break. What happens, the hardest thing is to have to deal with what we are, which are gatekeepers. People see the agents as the gatekeepers in order to get to publishing, to major houses, and that's true. It's not always true with smaller presses. You don't really have to have an agent to go to some of the smaller presses. But the gatekeepers, there are millions, not millions, when I started in publishing, there were maybe 40 MFA programs. Now there are 2,000 or 3,000. So there are all these programs that are pumping out young writers and people who want to be published, but it's like the channel is not wide enough to take in all of the writers. There has to be some way of sorting this out. We get so far behind. I have, you know, in fact, we've been discouraging queries, but I probably still have several thousand queries sitting in my back computer with an automatic message saying that, you know, we're not accepting queries now, but we'll try back again. Sometimes I go sit and read them and I find something and pull it out. An agent who says they're not accepting new clients will always accept a client if they fall in love, because this is a business about falling in love. And so you have to keep trying, you have to not get discouraged, you have to understand in some ways it's not personal and there are only so many hours in the day, and you have to have pity for the amount of work that land on agents' desks too.
Yeah. I think you bring up a really good point, and we were talking before we sat down here today about books and how we all three came to this process through a love of books. So I want to start with Sonja and then ask you, Marly, what was the first book you fell in love with? And what was that like?
Well, I was one of those tiny tots who learned how to read really early, so I'm not sure what book I first fell in love with. I was probably still chewing them at the time that I fell in love with a book. I remember from when I was very small, a children's book about a rabbit called Miffy. And there was a sentence in that book that I would just read over and over again, and I think it was something like, "Wait for me," cried Miffy soon. And that was so wrong, because what was that word soon doing in there? And so I thought, what does it mean? That sentence just fascinated me. I think I might have been 4.
I remember we had, what was it called? It was a series of books, children's something or other, and they had beautiful illustrations. They were fairy tales. I loved fairy tales from the very beginning. I loved, I am very romantic. I loved when I fell in love with the Robin Hood books. I had this weird Maid Marian fantasy going that I thought I would be whatever, right? So, they're different books at different times. And I remember when my father was reading My Name is Aram by William Saroyan, and he was laughing and enjoying it so much. And I was young, I was probably 10 or something. And I wanted to read it because my father loved it. And then I loved it too, you know. And it was a family story. And so
That's a magnificent thing when it happens when your parents are very literary people and they're reading great books. And because my mother's not here, I can tell this. My mom came back to reading when I was in elementary school, and the first book that I really remember her devouring was Mommy Dearest. And we used to like run around the house yelling, "No more wire hangers," because it was just hilarious. But she went directly from Mommy Dearest to, just dime store romances. And she liked the big, blowsy ones, like with the history and the covers. And I was in middle school. I mean, it was a confluence of taste. And so she would sort of casually leave them on the kitchen counter, and she would tell me which pages I had to skip.
Did you skip that?
No, of course not. No, I mean, you go there first. Exactly. But, that was like a steady diet of 12, 13, 14-year-old romance novels. Sorry, Mom. How much time do we have, Betsy? Are we 5 minutes? Okay. Sonja, what are you working on now?
I have just finished, I hope finished, a book and sent it to my agent in an email, and so I expect in a couple of weeks she'll tell me how much not finished it actually is, and start the next round of revisions. But yes, if it comes out, it'll be a book-sized book, so I'll be impressed.
Can you tell us anything about it, or do you not like to talk about work while you're working?
It's sort of a family mystery with a ghost in it.
But no dead dogs.
No
dead.
well,
Oh,
no dogs, no dogs.
And Marly, you have some books that you brought with you that you're really excited about.
Actually, because I had been publishing for so long, and I got very unhappy with one of the publishers who was publishing Cassandra King, I thought, you know what, you're not doing a good job, I can do better. And so we published, we set up a publishing imprint, and I don't intend to do a lot of publishing, but Cassandra King's Moonrise was published out of our agency, and we set up an imprint called Maiden Lane. And we have a new book by Cassandra King, which is a commencement address she gave, which is The Same Sweet Girl's Guide to Life, Advice from a Failed Southern Belle. And that's coming out. There's some postcards up by the table. But, the thing that I'm excited about on the agent side is that, I don't know if you guys read poets and writers, but honestly, sometimes it makes me feel happy, like that there really is a world out there where the things that we do have value. And you can find lots of good information about contests, places to submit. When you see the letter that I'm going to show you, the writer who I took on when I thought that I really couldn't take on anyone had published in Glimmer Train. He published in a lot of places. He attended some writers' conferences. He detailed all of that in the letter. A small synopsis of the novel, which intrigued me. It wasn't, there were no vampires and crazy stuff. It was about a family, which I have a soft spot for. It felt like it had a lot of heart, which appeals to me. And I decided to take a chance to read it. And I read it, and I signed him on. So, but there are times I go through a Poets and Writers magazine, and it makes me happy. And I don't know how you guys would feel about it, but we need to feel a legitimate sense that what we do is important, and that there's a world out there that supports us. Because while you guys get rejection, I get rejection for all my authors. I'm the front line. And so I'm sending stuff out, and people are saying, well, no, it seems familiar, or it doesn't work for me, or I don't think this, or what, I've got something else on the list. And I take a ton of rejection for every sale I make. And I make some very good sales, and I have some very good writers, but I'm constantly having to grind out and feel good about it, and really make myself feel more positive about the business. And I find reading Poets and Writers actually helps. And when I walked out of the office, I picked it up, and lo and behold, there's an article here about 3 writers, 3 novelists pushed past commercial failure. And one of them is mine. And it was a writer I took on. She'd had another agent, and the book didn't do well, and then years went by. And this book is coming out in a month or two. It's called The Anatomy Lesson, Nina Siegel, and it's the story of the painting that Rembrandt did when he was 28 years old of that dissection. It was an annual thing that took place in Amsterdam. And the painting was on her wall, her father's wall, he was a doctor. And she was always fascinated with it and decided she wanted to tell the story of everyone in the painting, including the dead man on the table and also the woman who loved the dead man on the table. And I sold this, I had 5 publishers interested, and I sold it to Nanchales. But it was, you know, it was thrilling to see that it was one of the books that they said, a rebirth of a career. And that's one of the hardest things to do these days, is to give someone a second chance. Publishers look for the first novel that doesn't have the novelist doesn't have a track record. You know, the computer tells the story. I send books in that I think are good, and then they'll come back and they'll say, well, we looked on BookScan and the author's numbers are terrible. We just don't feel we can overcome that. And that's one of the heartbreaks. But sometimes it happens. Sometimes it happens. With 3 writers it happens.
I'm glad you had a chance to get to know all these guys.